Hello, welcome again to Red TV. I'm Iain McNay, and my guest today is Steve Levine. Hi, Steve.
Good afternoon. Hello.
And Steve, of course, still is a very well-known producer, and he's produced Culture Club, America, China Crisis, David Grant, Gary Moore, Jimmy the Hoover, Beach Boys, Motorhead, to name a few. So we've got a lot to cover, and we're going to start, Steve, about what it was like when you left school at 17. You joined CBS Studios as, I think, a tape operator, which means you were just helping out in the studio, making the tea, etc. What was it like in those days in CBS Studios?
Well, it was an interesting time. So I was fortunate. I passed my 11 plus, so I went to technical school, and they had separate subjects in physics, electronics, metalwork, and all the different things. So I was able to do separate electronics and physics, which I really, really liked. So my understanding of sound and the science of sound was what I did at school. But very early on, from about maybe 13, I think I wanted to be a sound engineer. I'd seen a documentary about Phil Spector, and I thought, that's what I want to be. So I'd sort of focused my world in the last stages of school to become a sound engineer. So when I left school and worked in the studio, it was almost as if, here I am, where do I start? So much of it, even though I'd never worked in a studio before, so much of it seemed strangely familiar. And I think what was very exciting was that was a crossover period of time technology-wise. The mid-70s, pretty much 16-track recording was the norm, but very slowly studios were going to 24-track, and so CBS was one of those studios that was not an early adopter, but a relatively early adopter for 24-track, and then that opened up a whole range of clients.
And so, what people were you working with when you first started there?
Well, when I first started, I was the sort of tape op for Mike Ross. Now, Mike Ross, for those that don't know, is a very famous sound engineer. He did, during the 60s, he did all the Love Affair and those great records. He used to work for CBS at Bond Street. He was now a little bit older and had become a senior engineer doing pretty much all the classical music that CBS Records was putting through CBS Studios. So initially I was actually working on classical sessions, which is an incredible foundation in terms of some of the most important things which stay with me today, such as how to mic things up properly, distance of microphones, and if you've got quite a large ensemble, how you make the most of the recordings. And because of Mike's reputation, he got to work with the stars of the day at the orchestral level, and he was his relationship, I should say, with John Williams, the guitarist, was such that he did both John's acoustic work, classical, and his foray into electric work. But he also did all the major artists, so Daniel Barrymore and all those great conductors came to the studio. So for me, that was fascinating. So I learnt my craft with Mike as a tape op, and as you mentioned, in those days, this was the 16-track transitioning to 24-track. They didn't have a remote control for the tape machine. So if a producer said, go back to the beginning of the song, I was the person that did it. And also in those days, the clocks were mechanical. So if you made all the notes of where verse 1 was or verse 2, by the time a couple of hours had gone by, it wasn't actually the same position. They weren't locked. This was something that was so incredible when 24-track came through, because I had a dedicated remote control and it never slipped and all those things. So in the beginning, that was my job. And with classical music, again, this is something that stayed with me today and is so valuable with hard disk editing. So in those days, on a classical session, you have the main engineer, you'd have an assistant engineer, and you'd have at least 2 producers. One of the producers' job was to look at the score and make a note of where all the various takes were. Because for those that don't know, classical music was almost more edited than pop music. You would literally edit bars. And so my job was, the second producer would say, okay, Steve, we really like take 3 of those bars. And so I'd make a note of where those takes were on the analog tape, so that post-production, a week later or something like that, you'd sit with just the 2 producers and you'd go through all the tapes and you'd physically splice them together with scissors as well. So you'd have to know very quickly where those sections were. But that knowledge and understanding of editing classical music really stood me in good stead, initially with punk music, because very often they do 1 or 2 takes and you'd splice them together. But when we hit the 80s and it was really produced, that level of details was fantastic with tape, and of course as soon as we transitioned to hard disk editing, it was a breeze. I just knew how to do it.
Yeah. So you were working on classical
Initially, yes.
and then you mentioned punk, so that's a hell of a difference between
Well,
those two.
in fact, the 3 things that we did at the time was, so the classical sessions were the mainstay, and they were the kind of bread and butter of Studio 1. It was a 3-studio complex. Studio 2 had all the trendy rock and roll bands of the day, and Studio 3 was the old equipment from both studios that was moved upstairs, and the tape ops transitioning to junior engineers would get to work on the sessions up there. So as I mentioned, punk was just around the corner, and invariably CBS Records would scout all around London, generally London initially, so 100 Club and Nashville Rooms, Greyhound, and they'd see a band they quite fancied and they'd give them free of charge 2 or 3 days in the studio, just so that they could cut their teeth in the studio and the A&R men could hear how the band sounded in a studio, because it's worth remembering then that PAs are not what they are today. And so in fairness, a lot of the bands that were playing in, I don't know, say the Greyhound in Fulham, you couldn't really hear the lyrics, you couldn't really hear what the songs were, it was just noise, you know, and that was certainly the case at Dingwalls in Camden, it was just noise. So in order to judge whether they wanted to sign the bands, they would want to hear them under slightly more controlled conditions. So that was the role of, you know, the younger engineers, because of course we were learning our craft. CBS didn't want to put any budget into it, so it was a good way of us learning. The band's got the free studio time, but of course relationships get formed, and that's how I got to work on many of those early bands.
And so punk changed everything, didn't it?
It really did, because as I'd mentioned, working on classical music, you would generally use multiple mics on literally everything, and audio quality was the thing. And this was also due to the fact that most of the producers that did the classical music were American producers coming over, and they'd started to use very, very early digital systems, so they were aware of quality. At the other end of the spectrum, going upstairs to Studio 3, which at that moment only had 16 track, it was still the leftovers, punk wanted a stripped down bare version. There's a famous story that Simon Humphrey and I always tell about our very first meeting with Joe Strummer, that we had, because time was really tight, we'd preset the studio up as we would normally do. So that includes some screens around the drums. We put a selection of mics up just because we didn't know what the full lineup was. And the Clash were one of the few bands that we'd not seen live before we'd recorded them. Some of the other bands we'd actually been lucky enough to go, say, to Dingwalls or somewhere like that and seen them, so we kind of knew what the setup was. So we set up the amps as we thought they would be. Joe Strummer walks in the studio. The very first thing he did is he walks around the studio and he goes, "What are those?" And we said, "They're screens." "What are they for?" "Well, they're for separation." And he said, "I don't know what separation is, but I don't like it." So we took everything away and literally had a bare bones studio, as in Terry Chimes' drum kit set up in the corner as we would normally do, but there were no screens in front of it. We did make a compromise and put a screen in between Paul Simmons' amp and the 2 guitars, just to get a little bit of control, because obviously they were used to playing live. In fact, Mickey Foote, their live guy, was the guy that came in on the sessions to help oversee them. So they were very much used to one take live. And again, this was something that I've only recalled recently, because I did a radio interview with Terry Chimes, and he remembered, he obviously remembered the story I've just told you, but he remembered one other part slightly differently, which sort of vindicated something. So we did the very first take of the first song, which I think might have been Janie Jones. Anyway, we did the take, and as we listened back to it, there was a debate between Joe and Mick about the guitars, you know, who should play what, because those that are familiar with the Clash music, there's 2 guitar parts as part of the core backing track, and Mick generally did the lead parts and the little breaks, but there were more than 2 guitars on pretty much all the records. And that first moment, there was quite a heated argument over what it should be. And Simon and I said, well, look, we've got 16 tracks. Why don't we just record both guitars, and then we can decide on the master take, and then you can both double or add extra parts. And Terry said that small statement became the trademark way of recording, as in both guitars were tracked, so whether Joe was sort of going tick 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 tick, and Mick was going, you know, chords or whatever, that became the template, and then the layers were added on there. So that sometimes unintended consequences of it. And we probably used that template on many of the other punk bands that we worked with. So that would
did
be.
It actually change the sound?
It changed the way they thought about making the recordings, because the other thing that would happen in the case of the Clash is they could really focus on those parts. So much so, another anecdote for the Clash sessions, that when Joe then came to record his vocals, he was so used to having sang and played at the same time that we actually had to put the guitar around his neck without it plugged in, so that he could play, because again, most of Joe's playing is downstrokes in his parts. He had his famous Telecaster, and so when you're playing, as you can hear me doing, when you're playing like that, your voice is got a slightly different tempo. And so he found it really hard overdubbing with headphones, but if he had his guitar with him and sort of mimed the part, he could then sing the song. And if you listen to, unfortunately I've got a couple of the multi-tracks, if you listen to the isolated vocal track, you can hear very quietly the dead guitar going tick 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 underneath. So although they were great live, they weren't so used initially to the recording process. Very quickly though, under Mick's guidance, they became, you know, really slick studio performers. And when Terry left the band and Topper Headon became the drummer, it moved up another level. That's not to take anything away from Terry, but just Topper was a really experienced studio guy, because I'd actually worked with Topper before the Clash on some other sessions. I used to do a bit of freelance work here, there and everywhere, and he often was drumming. There was another client friend of mine who was a record producer, and he used him. So we'd sort of already met, and he was a real, you know, he knew how studio worked.
So how was it with you with the other punk bands? Were they all, because it sounds like the Clash were very professional, they knew what they wanted, they were good musicians. And a lot of the other punk music was much more DIY, which is part
very
of the
much
appeal.
was. I think it depended on the band. So a band like the Drones that we worked with, you're absolutely correct, they really didn't kind of know what was what, even though we ended up doing a whole album with them. But there were bands like the Vibrators where, I think because Knox was a little bit older, they also, and Pat Colley, they kind of knew the process. So, and Dave Ellis was a fantastic guitarist, or still is a fantastic guitarist. So in their case, they probably had more of an idea of the sound straight away. I think my recollections of XTC are really interesting, because they were one of the first bands actually that we worked with. My first sessions with XTC, I seem to remember, was 76. Now, they were very open to experimenting, even at that early stage. And I've spoken to Andy Partridge recently about things like this. They would be very keen on saying, well, the amp's there, but why don't we put the mic over there? And so you'd already see how Andy's mind was working, which became the sound of the later XTC records. He was aware of, okay, I'm going to play this part, but why do I put the amp on the mic there? Why don't I put it over there? That might be different. So I think, to answer your statement, it's really different bands came to the party with different things. But in all of them, in the case of myself and Simon Humphrey, we were learning our craft. That was the great thing. And if something went wrong, it didn't really matter, because the bands were getting the time free anyway, so they couldn't really complain.
Yeah, and you were still working as tape op then, or had you graduated to engineer?
Engineer on those sessions, but tape op on the commercial sessions downstairs. So you had this really weird thing where you were sort of sat in the corner on one session, you know, keep quiet and just press play. And then on those, you were pretty much, well, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? You know, so it's quite an interesting time.
Yeah, but what an adventure to have. To go from the classical and everything is so precise, and have this creativity with a whole new breed of bands that were coming
And
through.
funnily enough, that formed an in-between level with a couple of the other bands I worked with. So in the case of Sailor, I'd worked with them as demos. Now, for those that don't remember Sailor, that was all electronic apart from acoustic drums and acoustic guitar. Everything else was synthesizers, and they were really, really good. You have to edit there, so there's a terrible clunk there.
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
So they were pioneers of the German way of doing synthesizers. So all of the sounds on the record, the bass line, everything, all synths. What was exciting about that was it needed the same level of technical precision that you'd use on a classical session, but the innovative ideas that perhaps punk had. And then I was very fortunate that we had a session booked in for Hudson Ford, who was signed to CBS. Now, they were one of the few bands that we didn't do demos with, but we did the finished record. And they were using Robin Jeffrey Cable as their engineer. Now, Robin Jeffrey Cable was previously the engineer on many of the Elton John records and worked with Gus Dudgeon. He was unbelievably technically precise. I mean, I've never worked with anybody actually since who was, it was like making a Steely Dan record with him. He was so precise. So I learnt an enormous amount from him because he was using classical concepts of miking, like multi-miking things, but then because of the track limitation, cutting them down into little submixes. I'd not seen anyone do that before. Simple things like recording the drums over loads and loads of tracks. Of course, we couldn't allow all those tracks later on because we needed the vocals, but then he would submix those downs. Things that only bands like as I've learned, bands like Pink Floyd were able to do because they had unlimited time at Abbey Road Studios, but very few other bands worked in that way. So that Hudson Ford album, which I absolutely adore, was a real learning curve for me. So precision pop recording, but with the little bits that I was learning from either side of both classical and punk.
So you just mentioned Sailor, and of course it was Sailor that got you in touch with Bruce Johnson.
That's
right.
That
led you to the Beach Boys.
Well, one of the byproducts of working with Robin Jeffrey Cable on those sessions was that Studio 2 in CBS had an MCI desk. This is an American console and an MCI 24-track tape machine. But for the older engineers at CBS, the MCI was a bit of a difficult ship to sail. The main difference is that the older Neve desks that were in Studio 1 and Studio 3 worked on the traditional principle that the left-hand side had your microphone inputs, the right-hand side had your monitor inputs, and pretty much A, B, and that was it. The great thing about the MCI desk was that it had what was called inline monitoring, which was revolutionary at the time, as in fader 1 had a fader on it, but it had a little fader above it, which could be the monitor of channel 1, but it could also be the monitor of another channel. This was needed because we'd moved to 24 tracks by then, and at a very minimum we'd started putting 12 to 16 microphones on a drum kit, whereas only a year before it was 4 mics or 5 mics. So a lot of the engineers, the older school engineers, found that way of operating a little bit difficult. Because I didn't have the experience that they had, there was no baggage for me. I just looked at it and it seemed quite logical to me. So when Bruce Johnson booked the sessions to record Sailor, so Sailor was by then about to do their third album. They'd had some huge success with Glass of Champagne, Girls, Girls, Girls. You know, they were quite a big deal for CBS Records. So I guess they could afford the services of Bruce Johnson, who was presumably more expensive than the previous producers, who had made their name on the Sailor record. They became very famous afterwards. Bruce brought over his own engineer, Kurt Betcher. Now, Kurt Betcher, for those that really know their stuff, Kurt Betcher was one of the vocalists in the group The Association, and also co-produced and arranged. Yeah. And the reason Bruce brought him over was because Kurt was fantastic at vocal arranging, plus he had that sonic California imprint. He knew how to make those California sounding records, that very high sheeny sound, which is something that was very different to British records at the time. When you listen to records of that mid-70s period and you compare, you know, an Eagles record to a British record, there's a big difference in the sound. There's a sheen on those records, and I think that's what they wanted. So CBS initially assigned a senior engineer to work with Bruce because of the gravitas of Bruce. However, engineer that was assigned didn't know how to use the desk properly, and Bruce got very, very frustrated really, really quickly, to the point at which he said, look, Steve's a great tape-op assistant engineer, he knows the desk better than the main engineer, I want to work with Steve next to Kurt Betcher, they get on really, in fact we really did get on so well. He said, why can't that be the way? And the bosses at CBS Studios said, but Steve's only, you know, 19 or what? He can't, he's too young to be doing that, because I think I was literally just 19, possibly 18. So Bruce just said, well, if Steve can't do the sessions, we'll take the sessions elsewhere, which was incredible. And consequently, we had this very strange atmosphere where the windows of the studio door, which were big glass windows, we put paper up so people couldn't look in, because it created quite a stink with other people, you know. There was this, you know. I just like being really professional, and the sessions went really, really well. I thoroughly enjoyed working on those sessions, but during those sessions, Bruce just kept saying to me, Steve, you really should be a producer. You really have such an enthusiasm for the craft of making records. You understand about sound. I'll tell you what, when I get back to California, I'm going to call you and you can come out to California and work with me on some projects. But it happened. He phoned me and I went out to California and I worked on a load of things for him, because at that period in Bruce's time, the Beach Boys were on hiatus and he was the guy. You know, he had huge success. He produced the David Cassidy album. He'd had a lot of success with him.
Yes.
Plus, he just won a Grammy with I Write the Songs. So he was kind of a big deal producer. And we were doing lots of different projects. A lot of them were, you know, jingles and bits and pieces. But again.
And you were what, 19, 20 years old?
Yeah, 19, I think. Yeah.
Suddenly you were living in California and working with
just fantastic. And also working on records that were really different to the punk scene, because the punk scene was still there. What was really exciting about California, though, was the disco world that had opened up. I remember going to Kurt. Sorry, I'll say that again. I remember going with Kurt to one of the new gay discos there. I remember hearing Chic for the first time, and I went, oh my God, what is this record? And also in the sound system that those clubs in Los Angeles had. Yeah. It was fantastic. So when I went back to England, I was filled with this new sound that was really taking California by storm. It wasn't the sound of, which you think, the Fleetwood Mac, which I really loved. I mean, that was still kind of a big deal there. But this new sound, Saturday Night Fever had just come out as well. In fact, I went to see the premiere of Saturday Night Fever when I was in California, so that will timestamp it fairly exactly, actually.
And you ended up actually doing a Beach Boys album.
Yes, well, many, many years later, with the success of Culture Club, the Beach Boys again were at another transition in their winding road of a career, and Bruce phoned me and said, you know, we've just done a new deal with Brother via CBS or Epic Records, and we'd really like you to produce the record. They kind of needed my help to, you know, resurrect it. And also CBS Records at that time distributed Virgin Records in the US, which Culture Club were on. So there was this kind of thing, you know, this quid pro quo sort of situation going on.
Anyway, to keep it more in sequence, let's jump back. So I think you were producing the Angelic Upstarts.
That's right.
Who were managed by Tony Gordon.
Correct, yes.
Who also managed Culture Club.
Well, not at that time, but he became their manager.
Okay.
Yes.
So presumably the Upstarts, they were signed to CBS, weren't they, at that time?
No, EMI.
So how did you get involved with the Upstarts?
So the Upstarts came about because after recording the Bruce Johnson sessions for Sailor, coming back to England, Simon Humphrey and I were so enamoured with this disco world. I was fascinated with the world of disco, having just heard it in Los Angeles. And also, at that time, you had Giorgio Moroder with the Donna Summer record. This was before I Feel Love, all those early Donna Summer records. You had Cerrone and a French group called Voyage. There were these great producer-led disco projects that were really, really popular. So I said to Simon, we can do that. Because Simon actually was not a bad bass player, actually. I said, we know enough people that we can make those records happen. So we made a disco record. And I played it to CBS and they said, no, you've got to play it to Muff. I played it to Muff Winwood, who was then the A&R at CBS Records. He said no. And then it came back to the manager of the studio and he said, well, the dictum is you were using the studio without our permission, you and Simon fired. So we were both fired.
And they really fired you for that?
Yeah, we both got fired. But the irony being was that we were still working with so many great clients as engineers, because by then we were both engineers. So my clients, you know, Barry Blue, Mickey Most and people like that, still hired us, and Simon was working a lot with Jonathan Hodge, the jingle writer, famously did the Miles a Day advert. So we were bringing work back into CBS studios as freelance engineers, but being paid slightly more because we were on a freelance rate. So that was how our world started. We got a deal with the Henry Hathaway organisation on Satchel Records with the record. So Dance People was the project. Now, Henry, as you well know, had a little studio in Golders Green, and he needed some engineers to and obviously Simon and I were pretty good at our job. I mean, and I think it's fair to say we were good engineers. So we represented an upscaling of his facility by quite a way, because although he had an MCI desk in there, he did have good equipment, but he didn't really know how it all worked. So the deal was we could get free studio time if we did some of his projects. So, and famously, Simon did the Birdie song, but we did all these projects, all these weird projects for him as engineers. But in return, we had like a kind of credit rating for time. I then released a record on my own label, which Ashley Goodall at EMI heard. He brought me in and said, we'd love to work with you. Coincidentally, the Angelic Upstarts want to make a record. We've got, I think they were a little bit lost in direction. And the Angelic Upstarts, whilst they were a punk band, had looked at the way that I'll say the Sheffield sounded, because Angelic Upstarts are from the Newcastle area.
They were from Sunderland. They were very political.
Yeah. But they were looking at the way the Sheffield bands were starting to make a mark on the electronic scene.
Yes.
And Menzies said to me, we'd really love to use some of that stuff if possible. Perhaps a drum machine, perhaps some synths, as well as the guitars. Trying to imagine this world that was both punk and electronic. So I said, we've got a studio available. We can do it at CBS. We can do it at Satchel Studios, but by then I'd also started to have a little bit of success as a songwriter, and I bought one of the very first Lindrums. So I said, look, I've got this Lindrum, we can do the sessions. So I did the Angelic Upstarts album for EMI, but Tony Gordon was their manager. He came to the studio a couple of times and said, this is fantastic, I love how you work with the band. There's a new band that I'm thinking of representing. Would you have a look at them with me? So that was the start of the Culture Club journey.
And when you first saw them, what did you think, Culture Club?
I was really, well, first of all, the original demos that they had, you couldn't really make head or tail of any of it, to be perfectly honest, because they were recorded with, it sounded like one mic from a mile away, so you couldn't quite hear. What was most remarkable was John Moss's vision and how John was. Now, you mentioned earlier about the punk bands. Some bands had a vision, some bands didn't quite know where they were going. John had a very, very specific vision. He'd had, I think, a few months in with Adamant, and he'd also been in a previous band called London, which was a kind of punk, punk type band. So he had a bit of experience of that side, but one of the things his first comment to me was, Adamant's got 2 drummers. That is a nightmare. It's a nightmare live, it's a nightmare of logistics, 2 drum kits, all the mics and everything. Is there a way that we could have that sound but not have 2 drummers in the band? And also, George had been tinkering with the bow wow wow world and all that Burundi beat, So I said, well look John, let me show you something. I said, look, I've got this Lindrum and I could program a beat, program a backbeat, and then you could play along with it. Not imagining, of course, that at the time, because I hadn't worked with John in the studio, that, you just do that. So when we then spoke to Ashley Goodall and said, look, can we have a couple of days demo time at the Manchester Square studio? Because Abbey Road had a similar situation to CBS Studios, that all the junk that left Abbey Road found its way into Manchester Square, and they had a little studio that had all the, in fact, that was still only 16 track as well. So Ashley said, well, I can give you a couple of days, but no more. Because it was a real risk, and I think Tony really went out on a limb to try and persuade him to let us have the time. And up until that point, I'd not met George. I'd only seen pictures of George and John's description of him, which was Christmas, or just the very, not quite Christmas, but it was December 1981. And the reason I remember that was because that I'd signed my deal for Rondo Music and I'd got a desk diary for 1982. And the first entry I put in the desk diary was session at Manchester Square with Culture Club. So I can remember the date exactly. And that was January 82. So the first meeting of George was in the studio with the rest of the band. And John and I quickly programmed the backing track, the drums and everything. And then John played along with it. And I thought, wow, that sounds great. But you see, I hadn't really understood at that point, because I'd never combined a drum machine and a player to that degree. There'd been many instances, even with Sailor, where you'd have like a rhythm box and the drummer would play along. And Grant, the drummer in Sailor, was really good, but that you'd never hear them very loud. This was the first time the two were at equal level, and it was fantastic. It was only later when I worked with other bands who said, can you get me that Culture Club way of doing things with the two drums, that I realised their drummers maybe were not up to spec. John is, and still is, a phenomenal drummer who is able to blur the line between programming and playing, and that's why those records, still to this day, you can't tell on all of them what we've done. You know, some are real, some are not, some are both. But George was a fascinating figure because, have you ever met George?
Yeah, but only briefly.
Okay, so those that know George, if he was to walk in the room now, right this second, he would dominate the room and everyone would go, oh my God.
Yes, he's quite tall as well.
Yeah, yes, he's bigger than people imagine. Yeah. But he dominates in a really lovely way. And that has not changed over the years. So that was my first impression. He walked into the room and this, you know, bear of a figure came in, and it's like, oh, wow. In fact, the only person I get that with more recently I was very lucky with George. I worked with John Grant, and he's a similar person. He walks into the room and it's like, oh, that's really, you know, it's a rare thing that people have. So when George came into the studio, you know, he was listening to stuff, and we started recording. And the first two tracks we recorded as demos was White Boy Dance and I'm Afraid of Me. We thought they were fantastic. Ashley thought they were fantastic. Tony thought they were fantastic, but nobody else did. And it just took ages and ages and ages. And eventually, Virgin Music, through Steve Lewis, and he had an assistant called Danny, who's an American guy, who had been at the original gig actually, and had seen the band, and genuinely loved the band. And I think he persuaded Steve Lewis to do a publishing deal, which then by default persuaded, I think it was Simon or Jeremy. It was probably yes, yeah, or Simon. I think it might have been Simon. Yeah. But I mean, they're both involved. So either, for the purposes of this, Jeremy. Records, okay. Yeah. So by Steve Lewis signing them as a publishing deal, Jeremy Lascelles and the rest of the team at Virgin Records kind of almost signed them by default, and through Tony Gordon's persuasive way. And so then we started recording on a really low level, because we hadn't even been assigned to do a whole album. It was like initially a few tracks. But then things started gaining momentum, because White Boy Dance was the first single that we released, and it was very, very similar to the demo. We hadn't changed that many things. But for those that, you know, have seen all this great footage on these sort of 80s documentaries, there's the club scene in London, particularly around that period, was dominated by this kind of, it was disco music, but it was new romantic dance music, and of course there was Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran. But the 12-inch record had just really started working in these clubs, and we made a 12-inch of White Boy Dance. And I remember going to one of those clubs, I think it was Fubert's, although Gary Kemp says he thinks it was Freddie's, but one of them, I remember going to one of them and thinking, wow, the way that the audience is responding to this music is exceptional. You know, they were absolutely loving it. These great big long 12-inch records where there'd be, you know, there might be 30 seconds of just drums, you know, and then there'd be these, you know, timbales, and the track would build up again. Very, very different to kind of disco records, although they were, you know, they had a beat on them, they're 4 bass drum. And you know, the early Spandau records had the same thing. They were like, really, wow, these are. So I thought, this is going to be fantastic. It's going to be a huge success. But of course it wasn't, because it was so London centric. It didn't mean anything outside of this tiny world of W1. So still nothing. But then Peter Powell was a massive, massive fan of the band. So he offered us a Radio 1 session. And one of the things that was required was a 3-song set. Now, just before the band had kind of got to its fruition, we'd been experimenting with the reggae concept. So we had the song Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? But it'd never been recorded properly. I had a demo of it, but that literally is it. In fact, the demo's only got a drum machine on it, like a rhythm box drum machine. So we were really running out of time on the session, because you only get 3 hours. So I said, let's cut it live. So we cut Do You Really Want to Hurt Me live for Peter Powell, vocals included. We just didn't have enough time. And we all looked at each other and went, oh my God, and it was one take as well. That's pretty good. That's how I'm going to record it when we get to Red Bus and do it properly. So about a week later, and Peter Powell hadn't aired his session by then because they were done about 10 days ahead. We recorded Do You Really Want to Hurt Me in exactly the same way. Full live band, live vocal with George. George in the corridor of the studio, so I had a bit of separation. It wasn't the first take, but his vocal is one take all the way through. I think it was about a third take. And we just looked at it and thought, well, this is pretty good. And then Helen did some overdubs. Helen Terry did the ooze at the front of the song and the other bits. So we played it to, the way we played it was really interesting. Jeremy and Steve, I'm 99% certain came to Red Bus and listened to it and thought it was really good. George, on the other hand, had a rough mix or a nearly finished mix, which he then definitely played to Simon and possibly even Richard Branson. And they really loved it, but I mean, George has told this story himself that he was very, very nervous of it because it was really, really different. Although we all had such a love of reggae, that was one of the unique things. The band's musical taste was absolutely overlapping in terms of, Mikey with his West Indian, Jamaican roots, real expert on reggae and of course played great reggae bass. John understood rhythm, so he understood reggae drum beats, but he also understood African drum beats and contemporary rock, and he'd been in a punk band. Well, Roy, like me, was a massive soul and disco. So Roy could knock off those soul guitars like you wouldn't believe, because that was very popular at the time. And so between all of us, we had this great overlapping love of the music that was around at the time, plus the heritage music of being teenagers. We loved David Bowie, we loved Slade and all those sorts of bands, and T-Rex. So that's why it became a melting pot. Anyway, however it happened, Virgin decided that was going to be the third single. Bearing in mind we had two absolute flops, and I mean they were real flops. Other than if you went to a club, they seemed brilliant. And then the stars aligned. David Hamilton on Radio 2 made it his record of the week. And it's worth remembering back then, you see, because reggae was still quite popular with an older generation because of Lovers Rock had just started taking off, but the reggae of just a few years before, the Ken Booth reggae and John Holt, that was still Radio 2 kind of music. And it just, bam, record of the week. And the Radio 2 audience then, well, like it is still today, was a big audience. And so we were then very fortunate we got a Top of the Pops because it was the riser. Now the stories vary on this. My telling of the story is that Michael Hurl, who was the Top of the Pops director, wanted Elton John to play Blue Eyes live and he wanted to use the video. And so we got the space because that was it. The band's version is that Shaking Stevens had flu and couldn't do it. One of them is true. Either way, we got the sort of emergency slot on Top of the Pops. And the rest is history, because the moment he was on Top of the Pops, which I knew would happen, the moment they saw that band on Top of the Pops, people would go, oh my God. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah. I remember watching Top of the Pops. I went to the recording of Top of the Pops, which in those days was recorded on a Wednesday and broadcast on a Thursday. The second Top of the Pops finished. I remember the first call I got was from Max Hull, who was an executive at Warner's at the time.
He was A&R, yeah.
Yeah, and he went, you've got number one there.
Yeah.
And it just, everyone went, that is a great record. And it went slowly up the charts and became a number one. And it's what's really interesting about that is, do you remember what it replaced as number one?
No.
Pass the Duchy. The only time, as far as I'm aware, that two reggae songs have swapped the number one position. And that's again to emphasise how the reggae parallel world. Reggae is always like a parallel world in music. You start to look at facts and figures and you realise that it's always there. Just, there's not really mainstream radio that always plays it, but the love of reggae in this country is enormous. And so we had a number one record. I remember when it went to number one, we were actually on tour and we were in Glasgow at the time. And I remember Ronnie Gurr, who was looking after the band, came in and went, "It's number one." And George came into our room and it was like, "Oh my God, it's so exciting." It was really exciting.
What was the chemistry like between John Moss and Boy George? Because they had a personal relationship which could be up and down.
Well, they were like a grumpy married couple. And so...
But how did that influence the music? Or did it just got in the way, did it?
It did lots of things. It was generally speaking very positive, even though they were like most of the time. They were also very loving. There were times I remember going. In fact, after "Do You Really Want to Hurt Me" was the hit, we actually had already rinsed the first album, so we didn't actually have anything else. In fact, "Do You Really Want to Hurt Me" isn't on the. It's like, what are we going to do? That's the track on "Kissing to Be Clever." We need another track, so we then went into the studio and recorded "Time." So on the UK release of the first album, "Time" is actually not on that album because it was done separately. So I remember John and I had to mix the record in London and then fly up to Scotland where the band were on tour. It was just such a rush release to get it out. I remember sitting on the plane going up to Edinburgh, and he was just saying how much he loved George, and so there was unbelievable love. But they were different times. There was a lot of homophobia around the industry. Things have moved on. They haven't moved on enough, but they have moved on a lot. And it was hard. And I think their relationship suffered from that. I think that their individual quest for success also. I mean, in any band I've worked with, whether it's a heterosexual relationship or a homosexual relationship, having couples in a band is really tough. It's really tough as a producer because you get pillow talk, and the pillow talk is normally discussing the day's work, and then they'll form an opinion that you have to deal with the next day. And there's also a small amount of them and us appears, and so for anyone that wants to know how it really went on, get the box set and download The Argument, because there's an argument that we have our own version of the famous Trogs tape, which was how one of the sessions went. But there were also great moments of joy. I mean, of course, they were few and far between. But the drive for success. John's very, very driven, and he really, I think, brought initially the very best out of George. I really do believe that, as did Roy. Because Roy, as a guitarist, spent a lot of time with George in that nuancing of chord versus melody. So, I mean, they all did in their different way, but there's relationships that are really strong and powerful. But they all argue all the time. And
for a producer, that's challenging, having bands argue with each other.
It's fascinating, but we had rules in the end, so that what we did, which was great for me, we had rules that whoever was doing the overdub was the only person allowed in the studio at that time to work with me. And then when we finished what we thought was good, we would then play it to the rest of them. And that's really great because you up your game, because it's like, ta-da, look what we've been spending the last 5 hours doing. And then John would go, "Oh, I don't like that," or George would go, "No, there's another bit," you go, "No, there wasn't. No, there's another bit." I mean, oh God. So then I have to edit the tape back to my classical roots. So I'd have to go, "Really?" And you go, no, there's another bit. And I'm okay. So then I have to, copy a bit and edit it in or do whatever. So yeah, it's great. They're great times, and we're all friends to this day. We really are. And I saw them recently when they were playing in Leeds. And when you see how they perform, because they're actually now better than ever. They were always a really good band, by the way, live. Really, really good live, which was unusual at the time. But they're still really good. And of course, with the ensemble they have now of the extra singers and horns and everything, it's quite a show. And you see the reaction of the audience. You've got people of our age that loved it first time round. You've got children and grandchildren, and it's just, I mean, George is an icon. He is allowed to have that word, and it's fabulous the way that the joy that the audience has in listening to those tracks. It is, my wife and I went, as I said, to the Leeds. We left there, and it was like, oh my God, this is incredible. That's the power of music.
Yeah. So there's a lot to cover, so I need to move you on. So after Culture Club, Is it Jimmy the Hoover you did next?
Jimmy the Hoover immediately after that, because then of course what happens, which doesn't happen so much now, but you know, it's like your name's in the charts and suddenly every A&R man on the planet phones you and wants you to work with them. Because they think that you're going to bring something to the party that... And there are some cases where that is the case. And in the case of Jimmy the Hoover, there's a massive overlap. Jimmy the Hoover was fronted by Derek Dunbar, who was previously a Vivienne Westwood model for their outfit. So there was a connection there. And they were very, very keen, through their guitarist Mark, on a lot of the African highlife music. Also very keen on some of the polyrhythms that we had created on some of the Culture Club album tracks, where John, as I've mentioned, John had played, or we programmed, say, a straight beat, and then John had played some other things on top, and we create these faux African rhythms. So I met with them, and that was almost a no-brainer, because we just got on straight away, and they knew what I could bring to the party, technology and musical instrument-wise, but they brought a lot themselves. And so that was a joyous session, and it was actually quite a big hit. Sadly, it was with a very tiny label.
Innovision, wasn't it?
Yes,
Mark
and
Dean.
just at that moment, they signed someone else.
They did indeed.
They signed Wham, and so
Yeah.
suddenly, Jimmy the Who?
Yeah, I remember it all very well.
Yeah.
And then you were actually invited out to Jamaica to work with Ziggy Marley.
Yes. So I
That
got
must have been a real experience.
That was phenomenal. So again, because of the reggae success and I guess my name, I got a call. Initially, I think it was Jamie Cohen at EMI America, and said, "Steve, we've been having a meeting. We'd really love to have a conversation with you about doing a Ziggy Marley album. We've just signed them for EMI America, but we want to move away from the real roots reggae sound and do something much more like the kind of pop reggae of, because we, as I mentioned, 2 number ones in England had transitioned from each other that were reggae songs. So that's how it kind of started the conversation. They actually came, I'm pretty certain that they came to London, and I met with Rita, and because they're in London quite a lot anyway. Then it was all decided, okay, that's what's going to be the sessions. And so they have unlimited studio time at Tough Gong. And of course, being a reggae fan, I wanted to work at Tough Gong, so that wasn't really a hard sell. What was really tough was taking my equipment to Jamaica, because Rita said, we want to use the Fairlight and we want to use all those things that you've been using. And of course, in those days, there was these big carnets between countries, but also Jamaica had a particular currency control with either America or England, but consequently, the value of the cargo couldn't be too big. So there was all getting that. But essentially, we set up and started recording in Jamaica, and I loved working with them, and also the musicians out there were so fantastic. And then I get the call to do the Beach Boy. Now that conversation had already been started, but there was one final ingredient. I had to meet Brian, who I'd not met at that point. I've met everyone else, and it was kind of agreed, but the deal was I had to meet Brian and I had to meet Eugene
Brian
Landy.
Wilson, yeah.
So Brian Wilson and Eugene Landy flew to Jamaica, to Kingston, Jamaica, drove to Tough Gong, met with me, and I have a great memory. I don't have any pictures or audio of it, but essentially Brian sat at Tough Gong's piano playing me some of the songs that he was going to put forward, and then all the Jamaica musicians saying to Brian, "Can you play us some songs?" And he said, "What do you want me to play?" And they said, "Surfer Girl." And Brian played piano, and they all sang along, and it was the most fun. And I don't have a record of it, but I have a memory of it that was and I've spoken to people since, and they remember it as I did. It was an amazing thing, because at that point in time, if you remember the Brian Wilson cycle, that was the second time Eugene Landy had looked after Brian, and Brian had just lost all that weight. Brian was as fit as a fiddle. I mean, he really was absolutely, great weight, on it, like that. Really, really great. I mean, really genuinely. The whole Landy thing is a whole nother thing. And if ever, please watch Love and Mercy if you haven't watched Love and Mercy.
Yeah.
There are things in that are so accurate and so incredible. And for those watching this, if you haven't seen it, please watch it. I can testify to 2 or 3 of those events actually happening.
But generally, what was it like in the studio with the Beach Boys?
Very, very difficult at first, because it is a massive, as Carl Wilson famously told me, you got to remember, Steve, we the Beach Boys have a bad case of entourage.
Meaning there's loads and loads of hanging around.
Separate managers, separate everything. Like even when they're on tour, I don't know if I should tell you these stories.
But only tell what you're comfortable with.
Oh, I'll save those for another day. There are some brilliant moments.
Yeah.
But the upshot of all of this is my relationship with Brian changed over a studio argument, which I have quoted before, so I'm sure he doesn't mind me saying. So I mentioned Brian was in very, very good condition, fit.
Yes.
But he hadn't been in the studio for a very long time. And also, it's all very well singing once, but the demands of the record producer are often great, and it often requires multiple takes and multiple performances. And we were working on one particular song, and the first take was not bad, but it wasn't great. Second take was better. Third take was worse than the first take, and I thought, oh dear, we've reached that point where those that are really used to working in the studio every day can sing for 10 hours. Brian had sung for 45 minutes and it was already, he just didn't have the chops. He was tired. So I said, I think we should stop. It's not working. It's really not working. And the thing about the Beach Boys was there was a lot of yes men around. And I was, I had the hubris of youth. I also had the #1 album and single. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to say what I think. I've always been very honest. And Brian said to me, what do you think of that take, Steve? I said, honestly, I don't think it's very good. And you could hear in the control room, everyone deep breath taking in. Oh dear, shall I pack my bags now? And Brian stormed out the studio. So I looked around and I thought, okay, that's it. But what can I do? My name's going on this record.
Yeah,
and I've just got a great record. I can't have a record that's shit. Yeah. And no one needs to see or hear that, by the way. The Brian Wilson or the Beach Boys thing is so good. So the studio was like it was, so I carried on with a few bits and pieces that I had to do, a bit of housekeeping, tidying up a few tracks. Next day, phone rings. So this was also towards the end of the day. So I said, guys, why don't we just go and have dinner, call it a day. So we did. Next day, Tom Hewlett phones me, who's the manager. He goes, Brian's not coming in the studio today. I went, okay. He said, do you know where he is? I said, no. He said, I'm going to tell you. He's gone for some singing lessons with a vocal coach. Thank you. Put the phone down. It just needed someone to tell him that. No one else had told him. Yeah. And from that point on, it started to change my relationship. And the only other time it changed, I won't say the circumstances because that we had another studio fight, not with Brian, but I was really upset by something that someone had done, and I sat out. In American studios, particularly in Los Angeles, the studio backs onto an alleyway where you park the cars, the classic Starsky and Hutch alleyways, that you drive down, and that was the back of Westlake Audio. And I'd really had enough by then. I was just at the end of my tether. This was still quite early on in the sessions. I thought, what have I let myself in for, And I was sat at the back of the thing. I was really upset, like a combination of cross, angry, frustrated. And Brian turned up. And the way that it used to work was that Brian would drive his car in, and he had and I mean this, a Pinto. Those that don't know, Pinto was like a really cheap kind of car. I don't know what, it's like a Ford Fiesta or something. But he would be followed by one of Landy's helpers, just to make sure everything was okay. It wasn't like security, it was just, but for some reason, Carlos, who was the particular driver, got lost in traffic or held up in traffic. So Brian got there on his own, opened the door, parked his car and said, what's the matter with you? I said, I've had it. I've really, really had it. And he sat down next to me and he put his arm around me and he said, I know what you mean. They used to do that to me all the time. And I went, whoa! And from that moment on, our relationship changed. Because I thought, they put you through that same shit that they're putting through. It's the way they are.
Yeah.
And it was the most incredible thing. And many years later, and I always remember this, we were working. It was the live thing they were doing at Kenwood. You know, the Beach Boys used to do these things at Kenwood. So when you're in Kenwood, once you've done the sound check, you're kind of trapped because the house is quite a way away, and that's where the food is. And so they go on little golf carts to the thing. So all the band went off to go and have some food, and Brian said, I just have. There was like a tiny table with a couple of sandwiches and some crisps on, and he said, I don't want anything. I'll just stay here. So I do have a picture of this. So there's a pair of us sat there in deck chairs. It was a really beautiful day. Sat there and he was just chatting to me about all sorts of stuff. And I remember exactly when it was. It was the weekend of Glastonbury, and he said to me, "Where are your girls?" I said, "They're at Glastonbury." He said, "Give me a phone. Let's phone them and freak them out." You know, sadly we couldn't get a signal, which was really annoying because he was going to phone them and go, "Hey," you know. And then we do the first part of the show. There's like the first part, and then there's an interval because it's like picnic and sandwich and everything at Kenwood. And again, he came up to me and he said, "Can you stand by the side of the stage and watch?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm going to come up to you afterwards," he said, "and I want you to tell me about the vocal." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, tell me if it's any good or not." I said, "Why?" He said, and then he held my hand. He said, "Because everyone always says it's great, and you know it's not always great."
Yeah.
That, you know, they're the private stories, but I want to tell you those because I want people to understand what a heart he has.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And that doesn't always come across.
Well,
people have a view of him that's often very different. But he doesn't suffer fools gladly, and I think that's the problem. There's this shell, and then you're in the circle or not.
And I think people generally, not always, but generally appreciate honesty. And a creative person needs honesty. Otherwise they just go off on a tangent and pretend they're
Because
great.
Brian has a couple of dear friends that I've met a few times that are not in the music industry at all, that I've seen them with him, and you see the way he talks with them and is with them. They're normally wealthy individuals that don't want anything. Because the thing is with a lot of those people, and I've seen it with, I'm going to sound like a terrible name dropper, I've seen it with Paul McCartney as well. Most people, when they're around them, want something off these people.
Yes.
From a picture or an autograph to whatever.
Yeah.
So Brian is surrounded by people that want something from him.
Yeah.
And when he's with his friends that don't want anything from him, that's incredibly brilliant.
Yeah.
You know. And I'm so pleased and proud that I did that record. Sadly, it wasn't the huge seller that it should have been, but it formed a great relationship. My relationship with all of them is good. My relationship with Brian, and particularly Carl, was fabulous. My relationship, of course, with Bruce is as it is. And I saw all of them very recently when they played in Liverpool, and you know, we've got baggage, but it's fun.
And then you work with Motorhead.
Yes, well,
It's a bit different.
So carrying on with the EMI relationship, I was working with the only punk band that I'd not worked with at that time was Generation X. But I knew Tony James, the bass player in Generation X, and I'd already started working with Westworld, who was the other guitarist, Durwood Andrews from Generation X. Now, at the time, Tony had a relationship with Janet Street Porter. And Janet Street Porter knew like all these great directors of TV and all these things. And I had started doing film and television music as a result of working initially with Zig Zig Sputnik, because she came to one of the sessions and she'd seen how the Fairlight operated, you know, in the flesh. Because the thing about the Fairlight is the world's first proper big sampling computer. And unless you're in the room and you see what it can do, you can visualize a whole nother world. And Janet came to the studio, saw what I was doing with it, and kind of went, "Oh my God, that would be so great for some of the programs I'm working on," because the idea of sampling audio and manipulating it with the way that she liked the strange camera angles and all that kind of stuff, it was a perfect marriage of audio and visual. So I did quite a few things for her. So suddenly I started to get a reputation as a kind of film composer, TV composer, or TV, whatever, I don't know what the title is, but soundscape guy, that I could create slightly different things from the normal because I'm not saying that I'm, John Williams or anything like that, but I can do things that perhaps they can't do, And this program, Black Leather Jacket, came my way, which was on Channel 4, and they wanted a very specific style of music. But the director was very good friends with Lemmy, and he said, look, we've got this brilliant script, and Dennis Hopper has agreed to do the narration. Wow, this is fantastic. Commission to the Music is already sounding better. They got Dennis Hopper, and they said, and Lemmy's got this song that actually is called Black Leather Jacket that they've never recorded or finished. It just needs a bit of a tweak. Would you meet with him and see if you get on? So he came to the studio, and we got on. There's 3 parts to the getting on that was really interesting. So he liked the studio a lot, actually. I had my new studio in Fulham by then. So we agreed that was going to happen. He said, right, I'll speak to the band, it's going to be Motorhead are going to come down. So then the first day he said, but I'm going to put the bass down first. Okay. And I said, but this is for a film soundtrack and we've got really specific requirements because they're in post at the moment. And it's got to be, I can't remember exactly the time, but Keith, the editor, had said, it's got to be like 3 something or other. I can't remember the time. It was under 4 minutes, but it was like a very specific time. And he played the song through and it's like 2 minutes. And he said, well, I haven't got any more. I said, oh God. So he put the bass down, not to a click, I hope. And he said, Filthy Animal will be fine. He can play to me. He's done it his whole life. I'd never recorded bass first without a band. But sure enough, he was right. He kind of played and it was good, and then the rest of the band came down and played the track. And it was like really full on, but it was still only 2 minutes 30. But then he said, do you think we could put brass on it? I said, we can do what we like. So he said, what if we have brass on it? And I said, well, I can get some brass. So I used to know Snake Davis really well. So Snake came down and played brass on it. But that was a great thing because we could then use the brass to create an instrumental version to make the track the right length for Dennis Hopper's narration. And so during that day, I think it's okay to tell this story. So a very dear friend of mine was getting married, and it was his kind of announcement of the engagement party. And he only lived around the corner from the studio in Fulham. I won't say who it is, but it was a fancy dress party. So I said to Lemmy, Friday night, I've got to finish at 6 o'clock because my friend is getting married and it's his engagement party and it's only around the corner, so we can literally work to maybe 6 o'clock and I can just go round. So he said, okay, that's fine. So I thought, what am I going to wear? So my wife and I went to like a Fulham fancy dress shop, and the only thing they had left was 2 mariachi outfits. So I'll have those then. So we both put the mariachi. This is now 5:45. So I said, well, we'll put them on. So we're in the toilet, so she put the mariachi outfits on. I've got this really weird memory of Lemmy at the mixing console, and I've got a mariachi outfit on. And I said, Lemmy, we're going to have to finish. We're really going to finish. He said, well, I just want to do, I just want to hear a few more bits. I said, I've really got to finish. I can't do any more. I did tell you this. And he just got so fucking pissed off with me, like really, really grumpy. And in the end, I think I might have just turned the power off and said, I'm sorry, I said we had to finish. So he stormed out. Anyway, obviously I recounted that story as soon as I got to the party. The next day he came, but he came with his son. I saw a totally different Lemmy. Because his son said to me, was he being a bit of an arse? I said, yeah, he has. Because he knew him really, really well, and having him in the studio, and his son was really into some of the keyboards I had, and he could go, Dad, come and hear this, and it was like melt your heart. I don't think anyone has, well, maybe in a private world, but seeing Lemmy with his son, what a loving father, what a just a fabulous. And then that was okay from that moment. He'd obviously had a funny 5 minutes. There'd obviously been something privately that had gone down that he was a bit.
But you were honest and straight again.
Fabulous.
That's what you have to do.
And then a few years later,
we're going to have to finish.
Okay, well then and then a few years later, I met him at that famous place on Sunset Boulevard. the Roxy thing, and it was just. I was working with a band in Los Angeles, and he came by and said hello, and they were really impressed. That was anyway. Part 1 ends on Motorhead.
So I'd like to go on, but we have
I
to finish. Just tell us in 2 minutes, because when we had lunch quite recently, I was quite fascinated by the very different world you're in now, which is doing music for computer games. Just tell us very briefly about that.
Well, always I get these jobs because people either hear about what I can do, and it's always, this is what I love about my kind of skill set, is people are quite specific about what I can do, but then they don't know the edges. So the game had been developed, it's a company near me in Liverpool, but they had a very specific idea about the world they were creating, and they wanted this sort of 80s dystopian world, and they wanted the kind of sounds that people are currently hearing on a lot of electronic dance music, but also on some of the soundtracks. Actually, this was commissioned just before, the first conversations took place just before the kind of Stranger Things thing that we have now, because the game takes a long time. But suddenly there was Stranger Things, and previously there'd been Drive, and all these great soundtracks that hark back to Jean-Michel Jarre and Giorgio Moroder and Vangelis, and this period of time when the synthesizer ruled. Fortunately, I have some of those synthesizers still in my collection. And so when the games company came to me, they said, look, these are very specific things we'd quite like to have sound-wise. And I showed them a few examples of the sounds that these things make. And they were just blown away with it. But what's so great is mixing of vintage equipment that I still have, and also the modern versions, the new plugins that emulate some of these, especially given things like, like Roland's Cloud, where you can have 2 or 3 synthesizers that would have cost you, 20 grand in the 80s to have, but you can have all of them and you can play these parts. And you can, particularly when you're doing composition work, you normally have to have a sketch idea. Client comes down, listens to the sketch idea, and then signs off on it. So having those plugins like that is a way a modern producer can present their, look what I've done. And they go, I love that, I don't like that. And then you can say, right, okay, and then you can do it for us. So for me, it's another challenge, but it's still using the skill set that I learned back with Sailor when they had a 2600,
No, I love the fact you keep going for these new challenges.
Yeah, I love it.
Using your talents in different
I always
ways.
like new things. I do get bored, and I love new things.
Yeah, good. We're going to have to finish. Really appreciate you coming
My pleasure.
and talking to me, Steve. It's great to hear the inside stories. I think a lot of people will love those.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you again for watching Trero TV, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.